Overwhelming theodicy, especially in view of the Maccabees, for example, which Maimonides would have had access to, I presume, and also the Holocaust. Does he have any resources, or is he just going to tough it out and say that everybody who died in the Holocaust got what they deserved? I mean, with Eliezer in the Maccabees, I have the sense that a sage might choose to become a martyr in adverse circumstances, and that wouldn't show that that he was a fool or had fallen from divine whatever, and
Right.
yet he obviously was tortured to death. So it doesn't seem like a solution that's very sensitive to the cases.
I would have to agree. It's not much better than the comfort that Job's friends give him. If you're suffering, you must have sinned. And as far as I can tell, Maimonides fares no better with the suffering of the truly innocent than any other philosopher who tries to deal with it. I've yet to come across a truly satisfying answer to that question. What about infants or people who truly are innocent in various ways from evil and yet perish? All I can do is say Maimonides seems, for the sake of de-anthropomorphizing God and naturalizing Providence, seems to have given up, it seems to have paid a very heavy price, namely just the kind of comfort that we expect from the theodicy. I agree.
Okay, I think it's on now. I am wondering about this divine overflow and what exactly it really comes to. Doesn't anything divine really sort of drop out on your account? First of all, it looks as if the overflow of the divine intellect is just natural knowledge. And what does it have to do with virtue in any way? The virtuous person who is attuned to the divine overflow of the divine intellect seems to have the store of natural knowledge that allows them to predict what it is that will happen and avoid situations that will get them into trouble. What does that have to do with virtue, first of all? And second of all, there are going to be at least two different kinds of evil that you want to avoid. There are going to be, of course, the natural disasters, the earthquakes, the storms, fires, and things like that. But, that doesn't explain Christian's bicycle.
Right.
That was stolen by a person who presumably made a decision at some point to steal the bicycle. And however, if I understand the overflow of the divine intellect, how is being attuned to the divine intellect going to allow you to predict, for example, that somebody is going to come along and steal your bicycle? Unless you think that people are in some way or another determined by some sort of natural law, in which case, that, it seems to me, might undermine the other part of it, that somehow or another becoming attuned to the overflow of the divine intellect is something that you can voluntarily decide to do.
Right.
And so on.
I do want to bracket the issue of Maimonides' determinism because there's a great deal of ambiguity. And let me preface my response saying that there are, as most of you probably know, two Maimonides. There's the Maimonides who wrote Jewish legal works, which included a good deal of philosophy, in which the emphasis on human freedom has the upper hand. The Guide of the Perplexed is written for a very different audience. It was not written in Hebrew, it was written in Arabic. It's for a very select audience, and their determinism seems to have the upper hand. But let's not get tangled up in that. Let's assume that Maimonides' universe is a probabilistic one. And let me start with your third point. Christia should have known that her bike was going to get stolen if she locked it up so carelessly. In other words, the virtuous person, knowing what they know about human nature and what they know about the circumstances in which they live, will take the appropriate precautions to prevent bad things from happening to them. So not only will they not get on board the ship and avoid, or not, maybe they won't build their village in a coastal floodplain, so in case there's a tsunami, they'll know not to do that. But they will also know just the kinds of things that a person should know, having studied human nature. If you live in Upper Manhattan and it's nighttime and you've used a thin little lock, you're getting what you ask for. I don't mean to sound so callous, but I live in New York. I never lost a bike there.
But aren't there going to be situations in which some presumably free agent is going to do something that you can't predict?
Well, there are degrees of virtue here, and if you have, let's just say you've reached the truly intellectually perfect, you've become the truly intellectually perfect individual, you'll never be surprised. But how many of us, I think for Maimonides, there are only two species of individual who have truly perfected themselves to that degree, the philosopher and the prophet. Other people can become more or less virtuous, and the more virtuous you are, the less likely you are to be surprised by this. The prophet will know exactly what's going to happen. Not because they have some mystical insight, but because their knowledge of nature, their connection with the divine overflow is perfect, and they can translate that into good predictive behavior. Second, you asked, what does this have to do with virtue? It has everything to do with intellectual virtue. Moral virtue for Maimonides is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for intellectual virtue. So you could have perfected yourself morally, but you are not quite the truly virtuous person, and you will not enjoy the perfection that comes with the intellectual perfection. That is the summa of virtue. Finally, what does it have to do with God? Very little. If by God you mean a personal agent who behaves in the sort of anthropomorphic ways portrayed in, let's say, Hebrew Scripture, it looks like here God is merely a causal and epistemological source of things in the cosmos, the cause of being and the cause of knowing. And the knowledge that flows from God, I think it is very naturalistic. It's embodied in the active intellect that governs this realm, which is to say that anybody inhabiting this realm has access in principle to a body of knowledge. Does God, a good deal of that knowledge is theological, because it is knowledge of God. But again, as I said with Marilyn, I think your point is right. God really, as an agent, God drops out of the picture here on my reading of this.
Hey, Carl, Don, Eric, and Nancy are the next few.
Thanks a lot. Steve, this is just a quick historical question. Your reference to Job, I'll take advantage of your expertise. So you say there was this rationalist medieval Jewish interest. I made a casual reference to Job in a discussion recently, and then people just said, well, you don't understand. Job doesn't really fit into the mainline Jewish tradition, isn't really emphasized that much, just, philosophers sometimes make a deal. And so I just didn't know quite how to handle that, whether that's really true, whether this is something just sort of unusual, the way Maimonides picks up on Job. And then looking at that quote 6, this is a quote from Maimonides. Job knew God with a certain knowledge, and so knows that a human being cannot be troubled. I thought Job was troubled for a while.
Yeah.
But what do you think about? Are there more problems with these references to Job, or is it?
It is an odd book, and there's a great deal of debate about whether the author of the book was an Israelite, was Jewish. It's sort of anachronistic to speak of a Jewish author of a book from that period. But almost every major Jewish philosopher of the medieval period who I think would qualify as a rationalist, so Saadia ben Joseph, Maimonides, Gersonides, and even anti-rationalist thinkers felt compelled to compose a commentary on the book of Job. To my mind, there's no question that it forms a major part of the Jewish intellectual tradition. And even in non-philosophical literature, when in, I don't have the explicit reference in hand here, but if you go to various Theodician discussions in rabbinic literature, to some degree the Talmud, but even outside the Talmud, you do find Job mentioned. So it doesn't have the stature of the Torah, and the prologue and the epilogue make the work itself even more problematic because those are, scholars say, later additions to what was initially just a poem. But I'm not being a biblical scholar, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying any more than that. But it is striking how every discussion of theodicy in medieval Jewish literature takes its start from the book of Job. Maimonides' commentary on Job is in the guide. It's not a separate work. For Sadia and for Gersonides, they had separate commentaries on Job, which reflect exactly the Theodician philosophical theories they lay out in their philosophical treatises.
Thanks, Steve. I'm skeptical without having a lot of knowledge of Maimonides, but just can't be right what you say philosophically, I think. So let me say why. If I understand you correctly, what the person who is pursuing and achieving intellectual virtue is acquiring is a knowledge of how things operate in nature, which amounts to a kind of Baconian facility, really, that the person is able to understand how the world works, able to understand what the causal processes of nature are, and is then able to manipulate those to his or her own advantage, more or less. And that just seems to me way too mundane of a solution to the problem of evil for two reasons. One is that it seems to me that the problem of evil really strikes home when, despite knowing how the way the world works and doing everything you, as a human being with finite powers, can do to manipulate things, still bad things happen to you or people you love, right? So that's one thing. Secondly, though, I see a drift in your account.
Although you can, if my reading is right, you can minimize those.
You can minimize them, yes, but it really, the rubber hits the road when you minimize them as much as you can and they still happen, right? You do everything you can within your human, and we have to acknowledge that human capacities are always going to be finite capacities, and so there's something beyond that.
True, and that's why the absolutely intellectually perfected person is an asymptote, perhaps.
Good. Well, but see, then we get the second half of your position, and that seems to me to drift very quickly into Tuati territory. And that is, the value of this knowledge is not merely instrumental. It's not merely that I can manipulate my passage through the causal order of nature. The value of the knowledge is intrinsic. That is, the intellectual perfection itself is what I'm pursuing and valuing, including the knowledge of God, ultimately. Then if I have that, right, my whole scale of value is shifted now from placing, the value on the things that happen in this world, my bodily existence and so on, to valuing something quite different, which is, in a sense, within my control, but it addresses a different part of existence altogether.
Right.
So it seems to me that that's the deep part of the position right there, the part that you were sort of arguing against. Furthermore, just finally, it seems to me that some of the textual evidence that you were citing is completely consistent with that reading. Passage 8, for example. And then you yourself, at the end, you say, similarly, the prosperity of the wicked person is not a true flourishing, since the person is not enjoying the highest good, intellectual perfection, right? Intellectual perfection is what's at issue. It's not simply, knowing how the world works and being able to set up one's circumstances so one's bike isn't stolen.
Right.
Yeah.
There's no way I could deny that for Maimonides, let's call it the Stoic element, is trivial. And as he says, what?
No way you can deny that it's trivial?
Or say that's
No,
not
okay,
true.
okay.
Too many negatives. Okay, it's not trivial, okay?
Okay.
The Stoic element
Yeah,
is
no,
not
it's
trivial. And especially because for Maimonides, the highest purpose of the law is the study of Torah itself and a union with the divine intellect. On the other hand, the problem I find with Tuati's reading is that it either dismisses those statements from chapter 51 entirely, or forces a metaphorical reading upon them, leading towards the Stoic reading. And I just see that as inconsistent with what seems to me Maimonides' constant concern with our well-being in this world, not simply well-being because we've distanced ourselves from the goods the material goods and evils that come our way. But